Hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, there is a corruptive force coursing through the annals of American politics. And this is a corruptive force that we cover a lot on this channel. This is a corruptive force indeed that has itself victimized me, yet has not made me a victim, because being a victim is as much of a mentality as it is in response to a certain condition, whereas simply being victimized is an action that someone did to you. But I have been victimized by this mentality, as many of you who are faithful viewers to this channel will know. And this is simply the mentality of critical race theory. That is what this malady is, this sort of brutal infection that's coursing through American politics. And yet, Slate, which is a progressive publication, a publication that I would expect to not only be tone deaf to the horrors of critical race theory, but to actually form themselves an apologetic response to the critiques of critical race theory, have done just that. Slate has tried to cast criticism of critical race theory in this article that we're about to read as a partisan Republican attack. You heard it right. A partisan Republican attack. The title of the article here, which was released a few days ago, The Cynical Republican Attack on Critical Race Theory. Now, I don't read Slate. I don't like to read any sort of hyper-partisan publication. I don't mind publications that have bias to them, but as long as their bias not get in the way of the facts and the objects of any given story and reality, then I am absolutely okay with them. I like the Wall Street Journal. I like the Reason Foundation's website, Reason.com. I like those websites, but there are some websites, like Slate, like Mother Jones, like Breitbart, in which I think sometimes their worldview interferes with their ability to interact with reality. And this is something that even some of the most, that thinkers from the most conservative of people like Robert Frost to some of the most progressive of people have warned about. You have to understand that reality is an objective force. Slate does not understand that. But regardless, we're going to try to analyze this article here and make some sense of it, or try to make some sense of it. I've not read it quite yet, so you guys will get my reactions as we read it here together. So let's move on and try to see what Slate's apologism for the brutal infection that is critical race theory is. Let's see what their argument is in this sense. So the tagline says, the UN Ambassador's candid speech on racism is the wrong target for the GOP's latest propaganda campaign. So again, they're assigning solely a partisan motivation to the criticism of critical race theory. Now, my friends, understand, when someone assigns a partisan motivation to any particular criticism, what they immediately do, they delegitimize that criticism in the eyes of other individuals. That's what they do. That's their entire aim, actually. And this actually prevents someone, at least the person who believes that the criticism is delegitimized, it does prevent them from being able to actually interact with the subject, with the content of the criticism, because they believe that its content is already invalid because, again, it's wholly partisan. And if it's wholly partisan, it can't be based in fact, or so the theory goes. So Slate is already using, right out of the gate here, this sort of deceptive, untrue, anti-intellectual rhetorical device to destroy the criticisms against critical race theory. Be very careful for this kind of stuff, my friends. Be very careful with this kind of phrasing, because many of us, a great deal of us actually, can fall for it if it is said by people whom we agree with. By Slate, many of you in my audience, like me, don't like Slate, don't watch Slate, don't read Slate, don't do anything with Slate. But if it was a libertarian or a conservative publication doing the same exact thing, many of us would probably fall prey to it. Be careful of this tactic on both sides. All right, starting now. Republicans have found a new political target, critical race theory. Again, what did I say to you just a few moments ago? They're using this sort of rhetorical device to delegitimize criticism of the subject by casting it solely in a partisan light. Let's see if this article actually explains why the GOP is critiquing critical race theory. Let's see if it actually explains what critical race theory is. Let's see if it actually does the due diligence of an intellectually honest argument. They say this movement is sweeping the country, teaching kids to see racial bias where it doesn't exist, and indoctrinating everyone in white guilt. Okay, this is obviously a very emaciated view of what many people are talking about when they talk about critical race theory. A very emaciated view. So first of all, say that it's a movement. Well, critical race theory is not a movement, and I'm not sure there's many people who call it a movement. What it is an ideology. It's an ideology that is prevalent in institutions, and that is spread throughout institutions by particular people who believe that ideology. Now, it does impact movements, of course, but I think this is kind of a straw man. I'm not sure I've seen any person, I could be wrong, I don't think I've seen any Republican politician or anyone in general who was critical of critical race theory say, hey, this is just a movement. It's an ideology. No, that's right. It does teach kids to see racial things, and it does teach that white guilt is a thing. But again, this is a little bit hyperbole, because this sentence here assumes that this is the crux of the argument against critical race theory, but it's not. These are simply, these are simply symptoms of the greater problem, and many people point out these symptoms. But this is not where the argument against critical race theory ends for many critics. So we already have this sort of deceptive phraseology thus far in the article. Let's see if they can outdo themselves. It is true that in a few schools and colleges, attributions of racism have run amok. But the attack on critical race theory is misleading, because critical theories, whether they're about race, class, gender, or anything else, are useful tools for understanding the world. They expose problems in society that people in power would like to hide. All right. So Slate is not making any illusions of actually wanting to understand the ideologies that this person in particular is captured by. What is the idea of physician heal thyself? Look at yourself before you try to critique the world. Peterson has a sort of different attitude. He says, clean your room before you try to clean the world, before you try to fix the world. And Eric Clapton, the great Eric Clapton, one of my favorite singers, he said, before you accuse me, take a look at yourself. Now, Clapton was talking about in the context of a romantic partner accusing the other partner of cheating. But the principle remains the same. You have to make sure that you are doing your due diligence to understand yourself, to understand your position in this world before you go about running your mouth about other things. Why? Not because you cannot be correct about other things while you yourself are in disrepute and are in chaos internally. You could be, but the problem is the vessel for intentions is the body. The vessel for intentions is the body and all of its constituent parts. Your brain, your ability to walk, your ability to talk, every single thing in this body is a vessel for intentions. All that means is that it is a way for what you want to do in this world, for your message to get out there. Without your body, there is no conveyance of intentions. If this is in disarray, if a ship is in disarray, a captain is only as good as his ship. If a captain's ship is in disarray, how in the world can he ensure that the ship completes its objectives? If your body is in disarray, how can you make sure it completes its objectives? It's very hard. So Slate does not want to look at themselves. They don't want to actually consider, hey, are these ideologies a little bit too overly simplistic in their explanations of certain political conditions? Hey, are these ideologies being a little bit too prejudicial in how they form assumptions about certain people on the basis of arbitrary characteristics? Oh, hey, are these ideologies really operating in a framework of epistemic humility, recognizing that the world is much more than simply power? Hey, but no, Slate is not interested in any of that. They're interested in simply keeping with the program, sticking with the program, not deviating from the line of thought, not, as the great philosopher would say, using their good sense. And this is the fundamental problem that is incumbent to many evangelists of critical race theory. It's not the fact that they believe in absolutely outrageous opinions that are alien to reality. is not the fact that they try to estimate everything in this world through social institutions and believe fundamentally that the world is nothing more than a constitution of social institutions and the power dynamics between certain social institutions. No. It's the fact that these people don't have the willingness to simply look at their beliefs, still hold them, but consider them against other perspectives. For the critical theorist, whether it's a critical animal studies theorist, a critical gender theorist, a critical race theorist, for the critical theorist, other perspectives are innately harmful because those perspectives come from people in power. Slate is embodying the same mindset. Let's keep going. All right. Last week, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, gave a speech about America's history of racism. Isn't it interesting how they say that? America's history of racism. So, for this person, America is this abstract thing that exists and that has these definitive features that are universal. Now, if this individual was speaking of the foundational tenets of the American ideal, then that is correct. It is a sort of abstract thing that has material correspondence, in my opinion, but it does indeed have universal objective features. This individual, however, is talking about people. When he says America, he's talking about people. But very slyly, they omit that. This is the problem with so many journalists, so many political journalists or whatever, at least with this journalist. It's that they omit the necessary facts about a proposition which allow them to mold that proposition to their benefit, to their political benefit. When he says America's history of racism, he acts as if the idea of racism is embedded into the idea of America, and that's false. There have been people in America that are racist, but America itself is not racist. But he's using the possessive and grammar to confer ownership of racism into the fabric of America. This is what critical race theorists do. And it is fallacious because America is not simply people. People are the vessels by which America's idea manifests. America is an idea that has material correspondence, and those ideas of natural rights theory that were formulated from a universal idea of human beings having reason and being able to access the secrets or the truths of the world, of nature, through reason, and then being able to birth them into civil society, then civil society being able to protect those truths. That entire idea is the foundation of the country. But no, it's just America's history of racism. Nuance is dead, God help me. The next day, the Wall Street Journal editorial page denounced her. Miss Thomas-Greenfield seems to believe her job is to bring critical race theory to the world, with a special focus on criticizing her own country, the journal huffed. Huffed, God's sakes. How about American progress on race since the founding, such as the Civil War that ended slavery or the Civil Rights Movement? This has become a common epithet, particularly on Fox News. Again, so first he casts it as a partisan issue, the critique of critical race theory. Then he mentions certain news organizations, which may or may not be partisan, to reinforce that idea without actually engaging with the reasons as to why people might critique the theory itself, thereby not actually answering the critiques of the people and simply gaslighting them and demeaning them by insulting them, by calling them opportunists, by calling them partisan, hatchet men, essentially. That's the name of the game here, and it's dishonest. Any allegation of racism, even the most obviously true, is critical race theory. Again, this is hyperbole and a straw man, absolutely. Couldn't it be the fact that most allegations of racism in the common discourse are not actually racism and are actually a sort of image of what critical race theorists think racism is, that is projected to their narrow ideology? Is it possible that's the case? You say Fox News, like any other news organization, focuses on current events. And currently, a lot of claims of racism are not racism. A lot of claims of police brutality being inherently linked to race are actually not really linked to race, just to bad practices or to accidents or to whatever. I mean, so is it possible, Slate.com, that maybe, just maybe, the common discourse around race is predicated upon false notions of what racism is, and those false notions are influenced by critical race theory, whereas the statement that you made, that any allegation of racism whatsoever is racist, could it not be that plausible allegations of racism that rely on non-rhetorical definitions of racism are considered? But Slate is not interested in understanding this stuff. Thomas-Greenfield acknowledged simple facts, that slavery weaved white supremacy into our founding documents. God have mercy. And that recent incidents of police violence, including the murder of George Floyd, show a pattern of racial disparity. But she also told the story of American progress, including her own rise from segregation to President Joe Biden's cabinet, and she celebrated that progress as a model to the world. She challenged China, Burma, and other countries to end their crimes against minorities, and she called attention to discrimination everywhere. Africans enslaved fellow Africans long before the American colonists existed, she observed. But in many places around the world, slavery still exists today. She's right about that. But what she's incorrect about is the idea that slavery had any impact, any statement about the universal principles that the American founding was predicated on. That's just false. And the idea that Slate calls that a fact shows to me that they are far too ideologically possessed and bereft of reason to not only examine their own propositions, but to examine what they understand as factual. To these people, facticity, being factual, actually means simply confirming their presuppositions. It's obvious. Because it is not a fact that a principled statement of individual natural rights has anything to do with confirming or believing in racism. Because in fact, natural rights theory, as per John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government, is fundamentally and uniquely against slavery. And this perspective actually ignores the fact that many of the founders were either against slavery or they struggled deeply on a moral level with the issue because they had the principled obligations of the American founding, but they also had the political conditions of the colonial America in which slavery was a very, very, very powerful factor, and they thought they had to weigh those. But it was Thomas Jefferson that called slavery an execrable, those were his exact words, an execrable practice that was evil. But of course, Jefferson also owned slaves. There is a dichotomy within the heart of the American founding fathers that shows that these men were genuinely conflicted, many of them, and some of them were stalwartly against slavery. But in this oversimplified view of the world, this Slate author pretends as if it is a fact that not only is America's founders, according to him, evil, and indicative of white supremacy, and not only according to Thomas-Greenfield is this the case, but the ideas, the universal principles which do not require, the first principles which do not require certain circumstances to be formulated, simply requiring reason to be formulated, these very ideas are affected by a material condition. That is a paradoxical statement. That is a illogical statement, and yet Slate is sitting here saying this is completely and utterly logical. Look, I'm a hardcore conservatarian. I believe in the tradition of the organic moral order, as Frank Meyer put it, of the American founding, and I also believe that individual liberty is the primary value, and should be the primary value, of any social interaction. I am an individualist, much in the vein of Emerson and Thoreau, and the founders as well. But I also believe this. My ideas do not supersede facts. Not saying that my ideas are not factual. I think that if you reason them philosophically enough, you'll arrive to a first cause of my ideas that are absolutely factual in the grand sense of the word. But in the more confined sense of the word that we use, my ideas are opinion. And I recognize that, and I don't allow that to make me reshape the world in my image. The world is how it is. This Slate person obviously doesn't adhere to that kind of epistemic humility. Moving on. The point of these remarks is to make people think, not just white people or Americans, but people all over the world. And that's what a good critical theory does. It opens our eyes to things we hadn't noticed. Yes, exactly. This is what they're saying. Critical theory is this prism by which we are enlightened to the ills of society. The problem is, this prism only notices a unisingular thing. It only notices like a particular thing. This prism puts a certain idea above all other ideas that would be considered in any normal analysis of anything. So, for example, for the critical theorist, for Kimberly Crenshaw, who founded critical race theory and intersectionality theory, she said that if a black girl is having problems in school, her problem should be understood as a race and a gender problem. This singular paradigm of understanding problems through identity and identity only excludes other possibilities for why that black girl may be doing bad in school. Maybe she's a bad studier. Maybe she has home issues going on. Maybe she has a mental condition which distracts her. Maybe she has ADHD. Whatever. So it's odd that Slate proclaims that critical race theory is this grand expositor of all knowledge in the world, yet it itself binds itself to a very narrow idea of what knowledge is and what kind of knowledge is acceptable. Isn't that interesting? When we think critically about class, we begin to see how low prices, which benefit us as consumers, are often built on a system of global competition that drives down wages. Okay, this is just absolutely nuts. These people don't understand economics. There are so many economic factors that go into the production of low prices. Now, they may be thinking about sweatshops, but those are also those are caused by the conditions of the particular country in which sweatshops are actually caused in. And for people in that particular country, sweatshops are actually a godsend. You see what I mean when I say people have a singular explanation of these things? I don't. And guess what? If you're able to save... anyway, let's go on. When we think critically about gender, we become aware of social dynamics in schools, households, and workplaces that widen gaps between men and women. Again, this is the stuff about the gender pay gap and all that kind of stuff. Once again, I'm flabbergasted, people. Excuse me for my slow responses. I'm just flabbergasted at how ideologically obtuse these people are being. Because it assumes that if you think critically about something, you will ultimately arrive to a single conclusion. Which is itself doesn't seem like, upon thinking critically about that proposition, that is a critical idea. How in the world will everyone arrive to the same conclusion if we approach an issue differently? Are we all approaching the issue on the same exact basis of critical race theory stuff? Sure, if you use critical race theory as a mechanism by which you understand reality, you're going to get the same answer, of course. Absolutely, 100%. But that's not a good thing. That's not critical. That's simply using the ideology's framework to birth an answer. And the ideology's framework stands for itself or falls for itself. When we think critically about race, we begin to understand how seemingly neutral legal or economic structures, from credit scores to sentencing laws, can reinforce stratification. When the Secretary of Transportation says systemic racism is built into some highways, he's right. So again, this idea in this, so the Slate article is using the idea of granular wealth that says, okay, black folks have less wealth overall than white folks, and it must come from a single issue, which ignores the fact that there are plenty of white folks who exist in areas that are systemically deprived of many things. Appalachia is a good example of that. Not only that, but there are a multitude of factors typically for a low credit score. But again, when you cast everything in the light of a single race, it appears as if every single thing relates to race in some way, shape, or form. Delgado and Stefanik, the two people who helped launch critical race theory, said in their seminal book, Critical Race Theory in Introduction, they said, yes, racism exists in society because the working class and white elites keep it there. It couldn't be because certain people have bigoted views. It couldn't be because certain people are just stuck in their ways. No. It has to be because it's about power. Again, this reduces the possible amount of explanations for these very complex issues. The idea of credit score and sentencing laws, which affect many different people, are very complex. Yes, a lot of African Americans are impacted by the system, the justice system, but guess what? This is not necessarily because of racism. In the 80s, for example, many folks like to point out like the crack cocaine and the powder cocaine disparity. In the 80s, black legislatures actually pushed for crack cocaine to have harsher penalties than powder cocaine because guess what? People in their communities were using crack cocaine in very, very, very high amounts. And yet many people say, hey, it is systemically racist to sentence crack cocaine because black folks use it more than powder cocaine. Yet black legislators were the ones to do that. And according to the logic of critical race theory, black folks can't be racist. And even if they could be, it's not evident to me that black legislators who did that were acting out of a racist intent more so than they were out of an intent for quote-unquote public safety. Now, I think that all drugs should be legalized, in my opinion. I think that any sentencing of any nonviolent crime is bad. Any victimless crime is bad. But there are just so many different factors to explain these things than simply defaulting to race. We're almost done. No, we're not. Oh, God. Okay. Republicans are correct that critical theories can go too far. Like all theories, they can harden into dogmas. We start out seeing class, race, gender where we hadn't noticed it before, and over time we come to see it everywhere, yes, to the exclusion of other factors. Some might reject unwelcome arguments because the speaker is white or male. Others might recognize ethnic prejudice in proposals to limit immigration, but fail to consider how immigration, by increasing the number of people competing for jobs, can suppress wages. Others might be so repelled by sexism and abortion laws that we deny the humanity of a fetus. Okay, so finally, they are recognizing the limitations of these ideologies. Okay, let's see how far they go with this. In these situations, calling attention to race or gender can become a weapon to shut down conversation. That's what happened on Friday when Newsmax reporter asked White House Press Secretary Jim Paskey whether Biden might remove Thomas-Greenfield for her remarks about American history. Paskey shot back, is the president going to remove an African-American woman who, with decades of experience in the Foreign Service, who is widely respected around the world from her position as an ambassador to the UN? He is not. Paskey then admitted that she had not seen Thomas-Greenfield's remarks. Without wanting to read them, she invoked the ambassador's ancestry, which neither the journal nor inquiring the reporter had mentioned, as a rebuke. The question seemed frivolous, and Paskey wanted to move on, but playing the race card in this way was superficial and dismissive. Exactly the opposite of Thomas-Greenfield's approach. Okay, so look, they say that critical race theory as a dogma is bad, and yet they use critical race theory as a dogma to explain very nuanced issues like credit cards, like sentencing, like gender, and so on. So again, this complete and utter lack of self-reflection is reflecting on this writer on Slate.com's ability to see their own stuff, to see their own principles. So great, they're condemning this, but they're also embodying it. You can't do the same thing at the same time. Let's go on. When critical race theory becomes dogmatic, a good example is the New York Times 1690 Project, which Thomas-Greenfield saluted in her remarks. Originally, the project's text claimed that the onset of American slavery in the 1619 was the true founding of America, and that preserving slavery was one of the primary reasons that the colonists decided to declare their independence. But after historians point out these claims were exaggerated, the text was changed to concede that slavery was a primary concern only for some colonists. The difference between bad critical theory, which uses one factor to explain everything, and good critical theory, which acknowledges many factors. No, this is not the case. All critical theory recognizes and acknowledges a single factor. All critical theory does do that. Whether it's animal critical theory, whether it's gender, and that factor is power. So this author obviously doesn't understand how critical theory works. All critical theory is bad critical theory by the example of this author because all of them use primarily a single factor to make their analysis. The key is to think critically about everything, including critical theories. Instead of adopting an ideology and applying it to whatever comes along, dismissing every military intervention as imperialism, for example, we have to look out for our blind spots. When liberals say schools should stay closed for COVID, the rejoinder might be, how many hours of unpaid labor are we dumping on mothers in remote learning? When colleges stop using standardized tests and admissions on the grounds that wealthy kids get advantages, one could ask, do alternative admissions criteria such as extracurricular activities, give wealthy kids an even bigger advantage? When activists say police should be defunded because they're inherently racist, we might inquire, do smaller police budgets make life in communities of color better or worse? Again, you're asking the wrong questions. Again, because the questions are formulated from a context that suggests that someone is being aggrieved. For example, the school thing. How many hours of unpaid labor are we dumping on mothers of kids in remote learning? My friend, unpaid labor, my God, they are your kids. They're not a commodity to be bought or traded. They are your kids. And you take a tremendous responsibility when you have kids. I don't have them myself, but I understand the theory enough to understand that parenthood is not the same kind of thing as a transactional relationship with your boss at a business. Now, perhaps it can become that when the kid gets older as an adult, and you can have a transaction then. But when you're raising them, it's not like that. So again, this emerges from a feminist angle. The police thing. When activists say police should be defunded because they're inherently racist, we might inquire, do smaller police budgets make life in communities of color better or worse? Which suggests that we should be weighing value judgments on the basis of how it benefits people on the idea of their color, which gives skin color a arbitrary and superficial value in itself that it wouldn't have otherwise if we didn't give it so much power, my friends. So even his so-called good critical theory is just critical theory deceptively disguised with the lens of objectivity, but actually proceeding forth with anything but that. This is deceptive, man. It's deceptive. It's not right. That's the kind of skepticism we can learn from critical theory. We can see the effects of race and class, but also their limits, and this power to reconsider our assumptions in our society, to inspect, reflect, and correct, changes history. Okay, the uniqueness of our country is that we can self-criticize. Evidently, Greenfield is not self-criticizing her own ideas, neither is Slate. They are taking them as givens, then they are dressing them up under the garb of objectivity, when in all reality they are subjective propositions about how certain issues are caused. I don't think you will see a Chinese Uyghur getting on the national stage and acknowledging China's issue with human rights. That's what makes America great, our willingness to admit when we aren't. Okay, again, this was a piece that by William Salatin, I hope I'm saying his name right, that in my opinion was nothing more than a watered-down, half-hearted defense of critical race theory, while also trying to promote introspection when both of those ideas are mutually exclusive. And Thomas-Greenfield, the UN ambassador, her speech, in my opinion, was another overly simplified explanation of exactly what it means to be in America, what the history of slavery meant in the context of the ideas the country was founded upon. Greenfield obviously thinks you can measure everything by power structures and systems, which is why she mentioned white supremacy in her speech. And this author says it's a fact, then he immediately says, well, we gotta self-criticize, we have to reflect, but you're not doing it in your own work, sir. You're not doing it in your own work, William. William, I would challenge you. If you want to have a conversation with me, a pensive conversation with me, come on my show, Pensive Politics, my podcast. Come on this channel, and we will have a conversation over Zoom. Because it is my opinion that I don't do very good by simply sitting on here and dunking on you. Although I think that I do very good by exposing just how contradictory and ridiculous this article is. But you are a human being. And as a human being, another human being, I want to be able to actually reach the truth with you. So my friend, if you want to talk about these issues, you know where to get me. You know how to contact me. I will have all my information in the link down below, the description down below. So just please, if you want to have a conversation, let's talk. Let's talk. But as always, my friends, I love you so much. And please, if you would like to, support me on Patreon. Patreon.com/officialcwatson. But until next time, my friends, I love you. And please stay pensive. Bye-bye.